This week, we welcome John Loucaides, Vice President of Research and Development at Eclypsium, to discuss cracks in the foundation, the new Endpoint challenge. In the leadership and communication section, we're playing 3 questions. Does your board really understand your cyber risks? How can the C-suite support CISOs in improving cybersecurity? Think you're spending enough on security? And more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Most breaches are caused by exploiting oversights in basic cybersecurity fundamentals, but complex hybrid multi-cloud infrastructures make cybersecurity hygiene challenging. Red Seal can help. It shows you what's on your network, how it's connected, and the associated risk across public cloud, private cloud, and physical environments. With Red Seal, you'll get control of your cybersecurity fundamentals so you can protect your organization from the inevitable attack vectors and reduce your cyber risk. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/Red Seal. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 187, recorded September 14th, 2020. I am your host, Matt Alderman, here in Bronco Country. Yes, NFL Monday Night Football starts tonight. We'll see if the Broncos can actually win a game. But joining me from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, where the Patriots won this weekend, are my co-hosts, Mr. Paul Asadorian and Mr. Jason Albuquerque.
All right, one in the checkbox for Mr. Cam Newton.
That's it.
Let's see how it goes.
Got a W.
Yeah, better than Brady's weekend, that's for sure.
So this is the deep cover episode of 187.
187, yes it is. Yep. I recognize that reference as well. It was super weird watching football. Well, one for Pats fans, like without Brady, that was weird.
Yep.
And I mean, I thought they played really well. But also no fans.
Yeah.
And the crowd noise was interesting to me.
The
I'm
fake
like,
crowd noise?
do they have like an ML algorithm that looked back like at crowd noise on previous games, and then when certain things happen in the game, do they apply a certain amount of crowd noise? Like I was wondering how all that worked.
Yeah. And then the crowd cheers as their home team, throws a pick.
Yeah, right? Like I'm like, how advanced is this crowd noise? I'm like, that's kind of interesting. Anyway.
Which happened 3 times to Brady.
Right. Yeah, picks and sixes. Anyways, join the Security Weekly mailing list for webcast, virtual training announcements, and to receive your personal invite to our Discord server by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and click the button to join the list. Also, do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on any of the shows? Please submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guest and complete the form. I promise Paul and I will review those soon. This segment is sponsored by Eclypsium. To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/Eclypsium. John Loucaides is the Vice President of Research and Development at Eclypsium. John has an extensive history in hardware and firmware threats from experience at Intel Corporation and the United States government. At Intel, he served as Director of Advanced Threat Research, Platform Armoring, and Resiliency, and was a chipsec maintainer. Prior to this, he was technical lead for specialized platforms for the federal government. John, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we love talking to you because when we just have some great conversations.
I know. I love
firmware.
I love this topic. Of course. I mean, as John and I, we've chatted many times in the past about our shared passion for firmware and attacking and securing firmware. It is certainly one of my favorite topics. So, and I'm happy to get it more on the radar of the C-suite because I think it's something that they need to be aware of, but many of us understand the really technical details, right? My question for this segment, like as soon as I saw John was coming on the show, I'm like, how do we distill this up so we can underscore the importance for the C-suite?
Yeah. It's a huge blind spot. I mean, at the end of the day, right? I mean, a lot of folks in the executive leadership team think patching covers it all, but does it really, right? And this is where we're going to get into that conversation. Patching doesn't cover it all.
Actually, I love that way of thinking about it. And in a lot of ways, the thing that's missing is not different than what you're already doing. It's that what you're already doing just doesn't include this, right?
Yeah.
And there haven't been tools, there hasn't been visibility. It's been many decades of that, so people just don't think about it. And the visibility here is really the first problem. So I really look at the approach as first an understanding of what your baseline is, just the visibility of this area, this stuff below the OS. And you can really leave it there up at this level and just ask the question, hey, what do we have? And if you have the answer to that, that's impressive, because most people don't.
No, agreed. And I would say it's typically not included in a risk profile that goes up to the C-suite. Right? A lot of times you'll see patching statistics, applications being patched, server OS is being patched, but you're not seeing firmware patch risk
But you
could. And that's the point. Exactly.
Yeah, I kind of feel like from at least a technical capabilities standpoint, maybe not so much an awareness standpoint, that we're at the point where we were worried about patching the operating system, early 2000s especially, right, when worms were running around, taking advantage of flaws in Microsoft operating systems largely, right? And then we said, well, we need to worry about the application, like what's sitting on top of that operating system. Once we started to get a handle on the operating system, now I believe is a great juncture to say, I think a lot of people have pretty good visibility into their applications and operating systems. Now the third component you need to worry about are all of the other subsystems on the system and their hardware and software that we lovingly call firmware, because it's somewhere in between.
Right. You can actually think about the problem that you're solving the same way. And if you actually apply the same technique or the same process that you're using to patch the operating system, you're going to realize that there are the same problems too. So if you remember, there were many cases, actually some not even that far removed from recent times, where patches have actually broken stuff, right? You probably had one of those experiences, haven't you?
Oh, so
I know I have.
So many times.
And so this is one of those cases, especially where you're patching stuff that hasn't seen a lot of attention, right? If you're you can even look at it if you're running some sort of an OT environment, or you're running some sort of a dedicated critical offline, sort of doesn't talk to a lot of stuff, kind of special mission critical area. You see this sort of stuff, and you're very careful with it simply because it's not getting touched for a reason. Well, if you go and start touching in this area that you haven't really updated before, you have to worry, well, gee, is this going to break something? So the process that you tend to construct for that is this process of testing and very careful, step by step, put something out in such a way that it's not going to break everything, all have everything come crashing down. You're going to use the same process. And if you look at how people have over the years iterated on their process of deploying patches, even at the operating system level, you've got this sort of ring deployment, or this, I'm not going to break more than X% of the infrastructure at a time, and I'm going to be able to roll back quickly, and I'm going to have tested it, and all of these checkboxes, if you will. But they're not just checkboxes; they're what keeps your stuff working. So in the same way, you can apply the same thing to firmware, but the problem is that people haven't been helping you, right? You haven't been getting the statistics, the metrics, the attention, the visibility that you have at the operating system layer. And that's actually what brought me into this space, this whole idea of, I know it's here. When I was doing government systems, I was interested in this area because you'd spend this insane amount of money on some very specialized thing, and they would have all of this assurance evidence, but then it would come resting on an assumption on firmware. And I knew how to break that. And that starts to become really flimsy as an argument for a system that's millions and millions of dollars investment. So you just start to get interested, and that's kind of what led me on this path and ended up why I'm here.
I kind of feel like sometimes the hardware gets replaced before we can even address the issue, right? And I think it's important for this audience to know some of the history. My use case happens to be with Mac OS and Apple. And I remember reading articles a year or more ago where they studied the rate at which people were updating its EFI, right, in Apple hardware, right? Which is very similar to what we're talking about, it's a firmware subsystem. And they said a lot of people weren't applying the patches because it had a high probability of a high impact to the system. And so they were just never applying these fixes. And I think Apple was kind of trying to advocate for people to apply these updates. Some of them were security related, right? And people didn't. And I think the time that you have, we were just actually talking about this before the show, you don't refresh your Apple products in the enterprise or in I think a business environment as much as you would other hardware or in a personal environment, right?
Right. That I think you might be referring to the Duo Security Report, and they had a lot of, they actually surveyed a fairly sizable chunk of Apple hardware. And it was really interesting to see the different failure modes because, on one hand, you have things that don't get updated. The other hand, you have things that do get updated, but the update didn't work.
Right.
Now, sometimes it's because it wasn't supported. It's like it works for this hardware, but not that hardware. And there are all these edge cases. This is what happens when you don't have visibility, when you don't actually track, and that sort of thing doesn't get any attention. So nobody asks. They were one of the first ones who actually asked, and you found this really less than satisfying answer.
Yeah. So, John, if you're an enterprise today and you've got tens of thousands of desktops, and I'm sure you've been in these meetings, right? Like, is the question, do you update your UEFI or BIOS subsystems, or is the question more of like, have you ever looked into it, right? I kind of feel like we're starting at have you even looked at what that looks like? I
think so too. I've definitely had folks at all ends of the spectrum. There have been folks who have a smaller environment, and they have a spreadsheet. Yeah. And it's kind of cool. Like, you can do that. It's going to be tough after a while, but those folks actually really get it in terms of when I talk to them about, okay, these are the steps. This is what you need to do, because they did it manually with their spreadsheet.
Gotcha.
As you get into these larger environments, you get a lot of the, well, I can take care of this, but not that. And that's going to happen a lot. One of the techniques that is really useful is to just get that initial baseline figured out. So having some people who did some things is great. And that is them sort of probably working above and beyond, because it's going to be hard for them to do this. But if you can just get an initial baseline of, what do I have? What's it running? What are the associated CVs? And get that data from which to make a decision. I really do need to deploy such and such firmware update, or I better really watch some of these systems because they're riskier than the others. That's actually the first stepping stone to actually handling this. From there, you can actually go and start a regular patching cycle. You can start a canary system, and you can start the ring deployment stuff. But even just knowing what you have is probably a huge step, because you can put in place compensating controls. Right. If you don't know what you have, you don't know what to compensate for. Yeah. Does that make sense?
John, can folks start their journey by using some of the off-the-shelf open source and/or commercial tools out there that are provided by some of the manufacturers? I know Lenovo was really big on advocating for that, likely because they've had some issues with vulnerabilities and malware in the past that was targeting, right? And most others have as well, right? Is that a good place to start? I mean, people should buy your product, right? I don't want it to sound like a commercial either, but if you want to start down this journey, there's tools available to at least get you started.
There is, and where you can start by doing that is each manufacturer does a pretty good job of understanding their own hardware. The trouble is that at scale, you're going to end up with all of them, and you're going to have to end up sort of putting it all together in different ways.
Right.
And then you're going to have to put it into one common sort of risk management process. But even if you do it piece by piece, one at a time in all of your Lenovo machines, and you go through their system and you just see what you have, all your HP machines, go through their system, see what you have. the thing that they won't do that's going to be kind of interesting to think about is they're going to enumerate what you have and they're going to apply sort of, here are the updates that are available to you. And you can start with that. But one of the things that it's generally not doing for you is telling you the insight about how to manage risk, how to decide which things to go and do. You can just run their tool and update everything. But that's sort of the way that could cause a lot of problems. Or
Agreed.
You can follow the good patch management discipline and actually do that in testing, do that in phased deployments, and you'll detect a problem. But now when you have to back out, you're backing out of everything. And it's going to be very difficult to isolate which problem caused or which update caused which problem. So what we're really doing is start with a baseline. And you can use those tools to start giving you some information. And then what Eclypsium is really all about is to try and get you more into that process so that this isn't a one-time special case, each individual system kind of thing, but all the environment can actually follow the same process.
Yeah, and I look at this trying to do it at scale. I mean, think about it. We were just talking about desktops and maybe servers, but you know what? My networking gear all has firmware that I need to take a look at. My switching, my routing, my voice gateways, my firewalls. So I look at doing this at scale and doing it manually. Oh my! I mean, the challenge is just immense to be able to do it just in my enterprise.
I find though with networking gear, that's usually closer and more built into the operations than it is with a desktop or server environment. John, is that true?
Yeah, the networking teams are usually their own team, right? So they're actually managing which version of firmware because they have to use some feature or some bug that occurred with the previous version of firmware. Often it's a CVE, and they have to deal with those sort of things basically manually. And that's why you tend to have your own team for that. Plus, they also have sort of a different discipline. But they'll end up in a situation where they have to interact too. So they're interacting with the endpoint OS team, right, in some network layer communication bit. And where you get into some interesting problems is that the solution for managing these updates on their side may be very different on the endpoint, laptop, desktop, server side. And when you're dealing with those differences, it helps to have a common language, which is why I usually really focus in on this baseline thing first, because you need to know in some common set of terms what's there, what the real risk is. And then you can start talking about, okay, now you guys split off and fix this bit, and you fix this bit, and you fix that bit. And together you can do it, but it's really more of a problem of deciding what to do. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, well, it sounds like a classic vulnerability management problem, right? We can go discover that we've got a zillion vulnerabilities across the environment. However, which ones should we focus on and patch first? And we're working with many companies that are just doing an amazing job helping customers prioritize these vulnerabilities. But Matt, Jason, anyone, correct me if I'm wrong, they're still focused on operating systems and
100%.
applications, not 100%. On what's on the firmware subsystems inside the hardware.
Operating system, third-party software, right? That's where most of them are focused. And I think Boothole is a very interesting example of that, right? Because Boothole had a couple components, and you had to understand those aspects from a risk perspective, like how do I patch this? And what order do I even attempt to patch it in, right, John?
A bit. Absolutely. The funny thing about Boothole is that I always say that it's a great example of all of the firmware issues that I've seen, because it has all of the recipe of this sort of worst case scenario that's very common. And it's not like this is a particularly special issue. It's exactly the sort of thing that you get with firmware. So one thing is that it's very pervasive. It's more pervasive than you think because it's affecting the underlying firmware layer. Another aspect of it is that it doesn't get easily resolved. You actually need multiple updates in order to resolve the whole issue. And then finally, the updates themselves could break stuff. And that sort of interwoven, set of problems is very common to firmware. But if you're thinking about this and you want an analogy to what you can use to sort of understand what's going on here, it's the exact same problem as what you're seeing in your supply chain or in your third-party risk management, where you have embedded components, and those embedded components have vulnerabilities, and they're used and reused by many other different parties or suppliers, and you now see it in your environment, but when you see it, it might be hidden underneath 3 or 4 layers. But it's the same thing at the end of the day. It's this embedded third-party risk that you've now inherited, and you kind of have to dig into all of these layers in order to find it. Well, by looking at firmware and hardware, we're digging into some of those layers for you. And so some of the ideas of getting a baseline are really just a matter of actually going and tearing apart what's actually inside your system and just identifying it. That way you can make a decision about what you need to do with that information.
Yeah, and bootholes also in many of the vulnerabilities inside of firmware subsystems. There's this chance you cut the branch that you're standing on clean off and just fall to the ground, and now like there's no way to get back to the tree, right? Because you're on the ground in pain, and your system's out there. So if you break your system, boothole's a great example of that, right? Because as you said, there's software in the operating system, and there's firmware updates that have to work together to make that work. If you screw up, that's it. And especially as we talked about it, John came on Paul Security Weekly, and we talked about this problem with the remote workforce. It's even more challenging today to do these kind of things, because now I can't just go hand that person a new system or whatever, or go physically to the system and boot on something and fix it. Now that person could be on the other side of the world.
Absolutely. And you've seen that before. You've seen that with Meltdown Inspector microcode fixes too, where you had some performance degradation, right? And if you were running a data center, there's no way you missed it. So there's some of these cases where it's not unusual to end up with another problem as you're trying to fix the first problem.
Right.
So really it's about the process, I think. My view on it is, if you just start by kind of getting your baseline and then following your regular risk management process, but just including this layer, this new set of information, you'll actually have good results, because the risk management process has generally worked. It's just a matter of it being very iterative. You have to get started. You have to get used to some new information, not unlike any other set of risks.
Right? It's interesting, John, and this is a particular problem. One of our smaller sponsors, Vicarious, is talking about in-memory protections in the operating system and the concept of a virtual patch in that environment. And we've seen somewhat similar technologies in other endpoint providers as well. But that doesn't transfer to firmware, because if I modify the firmware, I'm still at risk that something could go horribly wrong. Whereas if I'm maybe running an agent on an operating system, I can do that, right? In firmware, like, could you run an agent inside of the firm? Like, it's just such a small environment to begin with that, I don't know. You've probably thought about this before, yeah.
There's a lot of options and possibilities here. We've actually thought about the idea of virtual patching ourselves. And what usually it amounts to is it's not that you can't do it, and it's not that you necessarily are going to break everything. You actually, if you bound and scope the problem just right, you could probably do this.
Yeah, that's Vicarious's approach on Linux and Windows operating systems, right?
But you see what they did is they scoped it.
Yeah,
and that's kind of a nice approach. And you could do that in firmware too, but where we're at as an industry, like Eclypsium, we have a bunch of firmware security researchers. Yes, we actually could do that, but the industry isn't really ready for, let's go in and mess around with your firmware.
Yeah,
because the number of variables is too big, right?
Well, the number of different types, right? Like Windows is Windows largely, right? But then we get only different subsystems. Like they're all different, right?
Yep. Now, to be fair, as this matures, that's probably going to be more of a thing, right? As the ability to see more information below the OS matures, you're going to have some of those variables filled in as constants. You know exactly what you're running, you know which hardware it's running on, and you know which version of firmware it has. Now I could actually do something, maybe, right? Like in this current world where you're not actually sure what you're running on, because you could be running on a whole bunch of different things and you wouldn't know, that's where this becomes harder to respond. And actually, what I love about what you're saying there is that you're actually kind of looking ahead to, once you get this baseline that I was just talking about, what are you going to do with it? This is where you go. This is where you want to go. This is the response that you want to create, but you don't want to go there without first having observed what you're standing on, that branch you were talking about.
Yeah, we've had enough challenges, I think, in our vulnerability management programs just to get that level of visibility into the OS and the third-party applications. You now add the firmware layer underneath, you potentially get a really interesting view of all the different assets that are involved and help to scope remediation better, because now not only do I know where I have potential OS and third-party application issues, also I correlate that with firmware. Now I can be much more specific about where do I focus from a risk perspective.
And I think, John, like for our C-level audience, right, the risk that, or the threat of malware that could persist reboots is very real if this problem goes unaddressed, right? I mean, just to kind of scope one particular threat, when that's really just one, but a very important one if you're looking at making your organization more resilient, right?
Absolutely. I think you just hit one of the red flags that you should probably be thinking about firmware when this happens. If you do have malware that seems to be persisting in spite of normal techniques for wiping and reimaging a machine, that's a good time to be asking, as part of your incident response process, what else is wrong here, right?
Yeah.
It could be all sorts of things, but firmware is definitely one of them that we're starting to see attackers use more and more.
Oh, yeah.
And an interesting thing about firmware vulnerabilities, as you talk about your risk management process, a lot of things, and this is, of course, how I got into this space, a lot of things have a dependency on firmware and hardware. There's an assumption about how a system works. And that means that a break down at this layer will break all of these other security mechanisms, which in fact is the reason why some of these attackers go pivot into this space.
Right.
You have an otherwise effective mechanism, but now I'm going to break that mechanism by not attacking it, attacking the stuff underneath it. And so that causes a little bit of a higher rating. If you start looking at more deeply into how do you rate the severity of these vulnerabilities, it naturally occurs that most of these firmware vulnerabilities actually undermine all the operating system protections, which causes them to have a higher severity score almost naturally. And that's an interesting observation if you think about it, because it means that you now actually are jeopardizing other aspects of the system with this one vulnerability or issue that you're dealing with at the firmware and hardware layer. And that kind of an approach, if you start to look at it, helps you looking at your baseline, which of these things should I go deal with right now as ahead of an attack? But then also after, if you're thinking an incident response, like the case you brought up, you can kind of come back to these vulnerabilities and start to say, well, wait a minute, I have this recurring infection, this persistence mechanism that's probably working against me. I can actually absorb whether or not this system was vulnerable to one of these known issues that allows such an implant. And that's part of the equation, right?
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, it's a combination of integrity, right? The integrity of the hardware system, but rolled into this, the concept everybody says, zero trust, right? If you're not looking at the firmware, how do you know what to trust? Because you don't know if the firmware is good or bad.
Exactly. Yeah, I think about the zero trust architectures a lot recently as folks are sort of moving to their next generation of architectures, and I end up talking with them about some of these things. A lot of the premise of that approach is really a trust but verify approach. And the whole idea is that instead of having this single sort of wall that if you're on the inside, you're good, we're going to just continuously verify that you're okay. That's exactly what I'm talking about as far as firmware and hardware go. And the problem is that nobody sees it. And so nobody's including that as part of that sort of device health. But that's exactly what your device health is based on. So I guess where I come from in this idea is to apply what you might think of as a device security zero trust approach, right? Where you're just going to continuously monitor and verify that what you're running on the hardware and firmware layer is actually trustable. It's actually okay to make these assumptions, or at least it's consistent and it hasn't been modified. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the old ring zero model, right? The the ring
researchers totally call these stuff minus 1, -2, -3.
Right. Yeah, because I guess ring zero means you're at the base. So yeah, you've got to be below zero. So you got to be in the negative numbers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's right. It comes from that whole x86 privileged mode terminology. And as you started digging, you can talk about virtualization, and you can talk about then the chipset and some of the aspects of what's present in the chipset. And you can talk about the CPU and different execution modes that aren't even part of the operating system.
Well,
and those sort of things just they just undermine everything. They're more privileged than ring zero.
We covered a paper that I feel like is squarely focused on this topic, and it's the blindside attack. Have you read that paper, John? I believe that you probably have. If not, I'll send it to you. But it's using the Spectre-type vulnerabilities and speculative execution to get around ASLR, the layout randomization in the memory of the operating system.
I like that one.
Right?
Thank you for mentioning that.
It sounds like exactly what you're talking about, right? You get down to that other layer. You're actually using features of the processor that are intended to prevent the system from crashing to find a viable exploit path to get around protections in the operating system. And John, this is exactly what you're talking about.
Yes. And if you try to generalize that specific issue across all the different components, and there's dozens of components within every computer, right?
Right.
You're talking about the CPU component. There's a whole pile of research. Actually, I love this speculative execution stuff because it's new. When we were doing this, a decade ago, I was thinking about that stuff in terms of covert channels, and it was a legitimate thing, but nobody cared about covert channels. Now you've got everybody caring about this stuff because it's not just this covert channel that is sort of theoretical. You've kind of moved that from the theoretical space to the practical space. And that's really interesting. As you see attacks evolve, you start to see that pattern where things just get better. The attacks really are more powerful. And so years and years of that sort of an approach, now not just in the CPU, but in every other device inside your computer. Wow, that's kind of an interesting space. And that's why I'm looking at it from a visibility perspective. That's why I'm trying to apply sort of this network-wide approach, because if you try and go after each one of those things, you're going to end up with one of those millions of dollars, very high assurance systems that you probably can't sustain. Very few organizations can really sustain that sort of correct by construction kind of approach. Maybe one day we'll see that sort of stuff. I'd sure like to see it. But right now, what seems to be applying to most organizations is really just a continuous risk management process. And that comes from the visibility. That comes from knowing what you've got.
Yeah, I mean,
we're going to talk about. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say from my perspective, right? I mean, from a C-level responsible for the security of our organization, I look at this as number one. What is the quickest path to close this blind spot that I have, right? And to me, it's because, again, it's a missing variable that has not been part of my program over time. And I'll put dollars to donuts that most CISOs aren't looking at firmware in their reports, right? So now it's like, where do I begin? All right, know what you have, obviously, right? That's typical vulnerability management. You got to know what you have. So I get a tool, I put it out there, and all of a sudden I figure out within my environment, hypothetically, I have 100,000 vulnerabilities at the firmware level. Now what?
Right.
Exactly.
Right? How do I get that next layer of context to know what to hit first? Because, just like starting a brand new patch program and vulnerability management program, in the beginning, you were inundated with this information, and we had to come up with some type of risk management process matrix to know the impact, the urgency, and the likelihood of that attack. How do we take all that, put it together at this level, right?
Yeah, that's actually one of you've pretty much captured the problem that we're trying to solve when we apply into risk management. And one of the things that we'll do is you'll naturally get that response. You're going to go run the scan. You're going to go see what you come back with in your infrastructure, and of course, everything is going to be out of date, and there will be known CVEs. Okay, so now I'm going to help you figure out, and my approach is this: to just sort of, all right, let's look at those CVEs. and let's look at what kind of attacks those really open up against your infrastructure. And maybe we'll be able to tell something about the context of which of those systems. You sort of isolate it into groups, right? These are my laptops that people take with them wherever they go. These are the servers in the data center that are, locked behind 3 levels of different access controls. Okay, great. Now, this is a physical attack. This is not. This is a privileged, software attack. This is something that's exposed over the network. And you can start working your way in to certain patches that you're going to deploy to fix specific things, but only to those specific systems.
Yep.
And then you're going to deploy more of a monitoring approach to some of these other things, really relying on the idea that if one of these things is exploited, say that there's no patch available. That's totally a common case. If that occurs, your best bet is just to see if there's actual exploitation. You can't update it and make it go away. So in a lot of these other cases, looking for the ability to discover whether or not someone's taking advantage of, say, speculative execution or one of these hardware firmware attack vectors, you would be able to see and respond based upon some input. Right now, there is no input. There's no visibility and monitoring down at this level, and that's actually kind of what we're trying to change. And it just starts from get a baseline of what you have.
Yeah. And I would assume at least from your platform, we'd have the ability to tap into APIs, so that way I can take your information, patch management information, CMDB information, put it all together, and get that level of context, right?
Yeah. And I think that's the approach in general, across many different vulnerability management programs, is to actually put together a lot of these different views. Like, for example, you might have monitoring at the network layer looking for a command and control traffic that's going to be, phoning back to some command and control server. And that might catch something, or it might not. And if it doesn't, it might be because you understand these indicators of compromise, but not those. Or it might simply be because it's not actually phoning home in that way. And so there's different types of attacks and different types of monitoring for different use cases of an attacker profile. So in this case, you're going to be covering a whole different layer of stuff that will cover a different layer or set of attacks.
Awesome stuff.
Yeah, it's the same visibility challenges we had in vulnerability management way back in the day. We're just one level deeper now, and we've got to go through that same maturity, Jason, that we went through in all of our VM patching programs. Right?
All I can say, if anybody from my team is watching right now, get ready. we're chatting.
I mean, that's what's happening, right? You see this with the attackers too, and why? I mean, I looked at this from a pen testing perspective when I first started out. Right, I was looking at how do I break this stuff, and I can actually go and think about all of the work I have to do to construct a browser exploit, to construct a privilege escalation, to construct and weave all these things together. And then I can try the same thing. And if you just give me one little interface to the firmware, the odds of that being broken are way high. So I have a lot of stuff I could do if I just have access to that firmware interface. That sort of thing is just really compelling for an attacker. That's why they're going into this space.
Whole new attack vector. John, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly and educating everybody on hardware and firmware security.
It's always a pleasure to be with you guys. Thank you.
Welcome. To learn more about Eclypsium or their firmware security capabilities, please visit securityweekly.com/Eclypsium. We're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.